Job security should be at the center of any technological development, and that's the general consensus among countries who met to discuss the Future of Work report by the International Labour Organization's Global Commission in Ballito.
South Africa has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, and the much talked about fourth industrial revolution might jeopardize jobs.
We don't need to be terrified of the changes that are taking place. We need to confront them.
But the SADC region, which is plagued by unemployment, is concerned.
I was sometimes saying the robots are going to take over, and there will be no more strikes and no more salary increments asked. But as a former fighter in my party, is a Workers' Party, I had to be careful not to be carried away by current position.
The International Labour Organization says the focus should be on people.
We want a future of work which is in the image of social justice and provides decent work for all.
And organized labour says job security is non-negotiable.
How robotics are going to replace workers and what impact is it going to have to job security? It is critical.
The ILO's Global Commission's Future of Work report challenges countries to come up with innovative ways of navigating this difficult task. Siphamandla Koke, Durban.
And the Future of Work conference was opened by President Cyril Ramaphosa in Ballito. Now, for more on this, we are joined from Durban by the Vice President of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Mthunzi Mdwaba. Mthunzi, thanks for catching up with us, or for us to catch up with you. I would like you to unpack in broad terms, give me a sense of the purpose of the Future of Work report.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you for having me as well. It's appreciated. The whole purpose of the Future of Work report really is launched in Switzerland, in Geneva, on the 22nd of January, and now starting to do the rounds at national member states level, because you'll be aware that the International Labour Organization has 187 member states throughout the world, and South Africa is one of those members. So the whole purpose really of putting together 28 minds from everywhere throughout the world, spanning academia, informal sector, business, trade unions, and other parts of civil society, was to try and see how we could shape and frame the future of work that we desire. It was to try and see how proactively we can come up with ideas of how, as we move into the future, we can be able to find ways of changing the world and making a better place, because of the kind of fears that some people have that technology would take over jobs, but also of the fears that the unemployment rates, which have been rising in most parts of the world, would get a lot worse. And of course, I think it's critical to mention that the International Labour Organization, as the only tripartite organization in the world, and tripartite really meaning that it's made up of trade unions, governments and employers in the same house, and there's a very, very much needed multilateral agency, which is part of the UN Common System, is turning 100 years this year. So as we celebrate the centenary of the ILO, we decided that let's put up this global commission, put up these minds from all over the world, and come up with these ways of how we can deal with the way the world is presenting itself in the world of work. And of course, the idea now, having had the report launched, is to have national member states discuss the content as a roadmap and as a basis for a much richer and robust discussion in June at the International Labour Conference in Geneva this year.
And of course, the focus is largely on the technological changes, but there are other factors that have to be considered in the current climate of work, right? I'm thinking of climate change, for instance, and the fight for gender equality. If you could please comment on the impact of the other factors that may have on work as we used to know it.
Well, the factors you've mentioned are some of the factors that we need to be alive to. We do need to be alive to the fact that, you know, as we look at gender issues, as we look at environmental issues, I mean, for instance, we had a conference on the 9th of January in Cape Town, which was convened by PAGE, which is an action movement on the green economy, and the ILO being one of the members as well. And we talked about how that would also impact hugely the issues of renewable energy, for instance, and how it impacts on the future. But we also have to look at other growth sectors that are affecting the way we think and the way we look at things, and the view that young people, as we move into the future, are looking for something completely different to what was there in the past. For example, there's a lot of young people today who are not driven by the fact that they may rise to executive positions of companies and be chief executive officers of companies, but are actually looking at how they could have the most flexibility, where for 2 days you might choose to go and do yoga, for 2 days you might work, and for 2 days you might, or a day you might look after your little one at home and not have somebody helping you with that. So there's a lot of factors that need to be looked at, and the skills, of course, that are required as we go into the future are very, very different skills. So you need to look at how skilling, reskilling, upskilling is going to happen, and also look at how, as we move into the future, we are able to have a good interplay with technology, whilst focusing and having a very human-centered agenda, as I had mentioned in the clip that was played before we had the interview.
And of course, in this space that we are discussing now, with all the changes that have happened and continue to happen, this has an impact on the labor laws of different countries, right? So let's look at the impact of that. The president spoke about the governance issues around the digitization of work. What does he mean by that?
Well, Tim, there's a lot of issues we've talked about governance. I mean, when he talks about governance, there's issues, for instance, relating to data protection. You'll be aware that there's always concern about what happens to the data that is collated every day by different organizations. Some get permission from you, some do not get permission. How do we actually deal with that? There is a suggestion, for instance, in the one of the recommendations to have what is called an international digital platform. Now, I must tell you, representing the employers of the world, that we don't agree with this international digital platform. We think it's highly idealistic, highly utopian, but very, very impractical in the way that it would work, because different countries have very different levels of digital, if at all. Some of them, for instance, from Africa, and this was an African meeting that we had today in Balito, parts of Latin America, parts of Asia, still do not even use digital. So if you are going to talk about platforms like that, that for us doesn't work. But irrespective, at some stage we'll all get there. And so we need to agree about how, if at all, we are going to regulate that environment. And if we do need to regulate it, and I'm saying if we do need to regulate it, because there's also concerns about over-regulating, which we have, which increases the rigidity of the labor and legislative environment, and then ends up affecting jobs adversely. Because whatever we do, we need to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. But as we look at governance and rules of engagement and rules of how we're going to manage the environment and how people are going to play in this space, we do need to also ensure that we learn from the mistakes of the past as well and not repeat them.
Now, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution as if it's something that is still going to happen in the world, especially here in South Africa, where the use of digital devices is relatively commonplace. But those in charge and who are influential talk about it as if it's something that is going to happen at some unknown future time. Now, just give me typical examples of how other countries in the world that are predominantly digitized are managing these changes, as well as compare that to the worst situation that you've come across in the world, where people were not paying attention to the impact of fourth industrial revolution.
Well, Tim, firstly, you're absolutely correct. There is this tendency of painting the picture about the future of work as if it's a house with windows and doors, and it's waiting for you to peep through the window or walk through the door. Future of work has been with us for a while, actually, but I think also what needs to be stressed is that some of the concerns that we have today have been around for a very, very long time. I mean, when I did industrial sociology at WITS over, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago, we were worried about automation even back then and how jobs will not be created and so on. So we've also got to be careful about how we over-dramatize the space and how we over-dramatize everything. But when you look at different countries throughout the world, you will find that the countries that have proactively come up with policies, proactive policies to deal with the world, although most of the world, even the developed world, has been very behind the curve on how to deal with technology. I'll give you an example, for instance, of the last 6, 7 years. Uber. You know, most countries, even the developed countries, never knew how to deal with an app-based company. When I travel all over the world, I used to find problems in Germany. For instance, in Germany, it's been discontinued purely because the world and the governments were not ready for that business. They had not created a situation where society is ready for it. So you end up having conflicts in society purely because, as some people would say, the law is an ass. The law is always a donkey that is behind the curve. And yeah?
I was saying that this actually offers an opportunity for the world, for the ILO, beg your pardon, to take up the charge of gender pay parity, that we are talking about technology, climate change, but at a human level, a lot still needs to happen. Women are still being discriminated against, and in some parts of the world, children are still forced to work. I read a report that in Ghana there are 30,000 children who work in conditions of slavery. So, you know, are you having a position on that?
Yes, I do. You know, Tim, I think there's a lot of issues you've mentioned, whether it relates to women gender parity, whether it relates to issues about gay people, LGBTI, whether it relates to child labor and slavery, whether it relates to freedom of association, which doesn't exist in countries like Venezuela and many countries not so far away from home, whether you relate to a lot of activities within the workplace which still need a lot of, I think, legislation or rather implementation. But I think what is very key is that we do need a lot of attitudinal change. If you look at the way we've been doing things, one always, and I like to quote Albert Einstein, who always says, we tend to do the same things and get incorrect outcomes, but always hope for a different outcome, which is a test for insanity. We do need to have attitudinal change with how we regard women. People talk about what is called unconscious bias, which is absolute rubbish, with how they deal with women, with how they deal with many things that relate to discrimination in the world of work or in society generally. If you look at the issues that pertain, for instance, we talk about a human-centered agenda in this report, in a World Bank report, in many reports. But when you look at the pecking order of ministers of labor at national level, because you must remember the ILO can come up with whatever convention, can come up with a recommendation, can come up with all sorts of things, but ultimately it depends on the ratification of that convention by a national country, and after ratification it depends on the implementation by that country, and there's a lot of lack of implementation by countries who focus on a rhetoric level rather than action. So if you look, the importance of labor ministers at home is not that great. Ministers of trade, ministers of finance, ministers of the economy are far more powerful than ministers of labor. Today we heard, for instance, about ministers of labor lamenting about having 1% of the budgets in their countries. If you have 1% of the budget, how far can you go with a human-centered agenda? When are we going to change the way we perceive people who are in charge of people? Even in companies, directors of human resources are not the most important directors.
And of course, and that's where you know the media, the public space comes into play to make sure that we conscientize the public generally across the board about these matters. And some of the workers who are paying closer attention to the future of work are actors and performers. And thanks very much, Mthunzi Mdwaba, for talking to us. There's new legislation that is on the cards to help actors and the royalties that have been denied for decades. We'll be speaking to Jack Devnarian. Stay with us.